We're going to dub it in for the rest of the day. Boy, what an illustrious group. I've been on the other side of the microphone from a lot of you guys, but it's great to be here and to share your thoughts and your memories and your stories.
Bill, when I came to WSM in 1940, the Opry was broadcast from the War Memorial Auditorium every Saturday night, I guess 8 o'clock till midnight. George Hay did run the show. He called the shots.
At what point did the artists start announcing their own songs, and at what point did the actual announcer come out to the podium and all, like all of you guys have done?
Yeah, well, I'm sure it was after it moved to the Ryman. I don't know exactly when that happened. One distinctive part of the Opry at that time was the Prince Albert show, which ran from 9:30 till 10 o'clock, I think. And Louis Buck was the announcer, and they would have rotating talent. But that was the highlight of the Opry for many of the performers, to get on the network, get on NBC. And I guess it paid a little better on the scale than the regular participants. All of the Opry, as I remember it, Bill, was always commercial from the time it moved here to the Ryman. At 8 o'clock, I announced the Purina show, which was local for a long time and was on a southern network of NBC for a while. The other shows I remember sponsored by Louis Buck did the R.C. Cola show. And I don't remember who was connected with some of the others, but each announcer had his own venue. Those were fee shows. They were important to us. We got paid for those. Louis had a very successful connection with the Royal Crown Cola people. He wrote and produced that show for many years, and I say produced even when it was local on WSM. He was taking care of that. I guess that was one of the longest commercial connections that the Opry had, except for the Prince Albert show in those days. I hope I haven't rambled too much, but I can get some fond memories recalled of people like Hank Williams, who was a real character for the Opry. And all of you have heard about Hank Williams, I guess. I remember one night sitting backstage here. Yeah, that lonesome whistle blow. And he turned to me and he said, "How you like that?" I said, "Hank, it sounds like hell to me." As it turned out, it was "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry," which was one of his greatest hits and a great song.
Well, were you hired to be Opry announcers, or was that like an extra tour of duty that you were asked to pull? Now, Charlie, you were brought here as an Opry announcer, weren't you?
No, I was brought here just to work on Music Country Radio Network, and the Opry was a part of that, a part of being here. But I was not. The Opry announcing staff at that time was not separate and apart from WSM Radio.
When you were assigned to the Opry, I mean, was this something you had to give up your Friday and Saturday nights?
I didn't have a choice.
They said be there?
Yeah, I remember Al Vex was the program director at the time, and I'd been with SM maybe 6 months doing a record show. And I remember one afternoon, he was leaving the station, and it was a Thursday, and he came in and he said, sat down, and he said, "Have you ever given any thought about being an Opry announcer?" And I was kind of bowled over. I said, "Well, no, I haven't." He says, "Well, you should think about it because you're starting tomorrow night." And I said, "Well, Al," I said, "I don't think I'm up to that." He says, "Well, it doesn't matter." And I said, "Well, what if I don't want to do it?" He said, "You don't understand." He said, "You start tomorrow night." And that was it. So, and I never did really understood what that was all about. So I said, "Yes, sir, I'll be there." So that was it.
Bill, I was hanging around guys like Tony and Hairl when I first came here, and I was a young kid, and I aspired to want to do that. In fact, I probably bugged Hairl and Tony and Ralph and whoever I was working for.
Well, you did.
I want to, when can I get out there? And they finally got tired of me bugging them and put me on the matinees on Saturday afternoons that weren't broadcast to shut me up, to leave them alone. So,
Sent you to the Ryman to the Fiddlers.
And that's the other thing. I was working for Hairl. Hairl was my boss. Now,
Can you imagine that?
he goes, you're going to get to work at the Ryman Auditorium. And I thought, wow. And he sends me to the Grandmasters Fiddling Championship during fanfare, and I get out here, and there's a pretty good crowd here, and then you've got 200 fiddlers that come out and fiddle for 2 or 3 minutes, and you say, here's number 1, and he will play. So after about, and the whole time I'm thinking, wow, I'm working at the Ryman. And I know Harold's going, oh, we got him to do that. But it was a lot of fun. But I aspired to do that.
I guess I'm one of the few that was hired to do the Opry. And then they had to find something else for me to do during the week. Dave Overton was the one that hired me, and he was program director at that time. And he was wanting to get off the Opry. He was wanting to leave, retire, I guess. And so when I came in, he said, you're going to do the Opry this weekend. And I said, what about next week? What do I do? And he said, well, find you something to do. So we had a show called All This News, so I went in there and did it that hour, and then it just, went from there. A few more hours here and there.
There's a generational thing that seems to be happening here, because it seems like the older guys, the ones who worked the Opry years ago, were pretty much just sent there. And I remember you saying one time, Jud, that that really wasn't a prestige job to get to do the Opry. Is that correct?
That's correct. Absolutely. Everybody wanted to be off on Saturday night. Not many announcers loved the hillbilly music, pardon that expression. But that was part of an assignment when I went to work here. Ott Devine and Louis Buck, David Cobb, Grant Turner, those were some of the announcers that were in my era. And it wasn't it was a good place to have a fee show. Come work the Opry and go back home. But as far as staying till that midnight sign-off, that was not the happiest part of it. And then there was an hour after the Opry that we went down here on Broad Street to the Ernest Tubb Record Shop, and he sponsored that show. And as it turned out, a lot of the people who left the Ryman Auditorium gathered around the middle of Broad Street and that Ernest Tubb Record Shop. That was a very popular midnight attraction.
I came to WSM in 1970 and came out at the station, and that's when we had all of these legends that Jud has already talked about. Some of them, Dave Overton, Grant Turner, John McDonnell, and I started in the promotion department, and that was right when they were dividing the Opry administration from the radio station. Bob Cooper and Bud Wendell hired me. So I moved down here in the next year or so, and never announced for the Opry, so I'm humbled to be in the presence of these legends.
You should be.
We wondered what you were doing here, quite frankly. We thought you were Hal Durham's official representative.
As Hairl Weekly would say, all network quality, right there. But I came down here, and I remember there were some strange things going on, and not only inside the building, but outside the building. We had characters around here. One was up and down the alley, Pat O'Malley, who slept in a dumpster out here. And one morning, the Metro garbage people were hauling him off, and he popped up out of the top and started cursing and screaming. So
moving his house.
moving his house. Yeah. And the show itself, I know we had a thermometer out there one time. It was 120 degrees out in the audience. And I was in the ticket office, which was on Fifth Avenue. It's on 4th Avenue now. And a lady came up, and she was very, very disturbed about her seat. The benches that we still have here now, but they've been repaired, they all had cracks in them. And you'd try to hold them up with Coke cases. And she said, every time somebody moves on the other end of the bench, it pinches me. So I tried to be as sympathetic, as I could, and finally she said, I don't mind getting pinched, but I want a hand on the other end. So I tried to find Harold to help her out, but he wasn't there.
Oh, yeah.
But there was a lot of funny things that went on down here.
Were you here? There's a legendary story. George Morgan, who on the stage was one of the most serious just real down-to-earth kinds of guy. Was the greatest practical joker in the world. There's a legendary story about George Morgan out in the alley with a group of people that guys wanted to audition for the Opry. Yeah. Were you here when that happened? Well, the way the story goes was that George told them that the Opry was not looking for any singers, but we needed some dancers, and he got them up on the little tin roof out there in the back, and they raised such a ruckus tap dancing or whatever on the roof that I think Jim Denny or whoever was running the Opry came out and fired Morgan.
Talking about George Morgan and that first time experience. After I got past the you don't have any choice situation on it, went out to the Opry, and like Eddie, I was just, I could have fed a sewing machine running. I'd never been so nervous in my entire life. So I think it was Hal that finally walked up and said, you do the 11 o'clock show, which I think Coca-Cola sponsored for years. And George Morgan was the headliner that night. So I walked out to center stage, stuck my hand out, and introduced myself. And George said, you're the new guy, aren't you? I said, yes, sir. And he put his arm around me and kind of gave me a little hug, and he said, don't worry, kid. He said, I'm going to walk you through this, make you look like $1 million. And he did. And I have never forgotten that kindness to this day. I mean, that was one of the nicest things anybody ever did for me.
But remember what happened with George and Roy Wiggins. You thought they lived together.
Yeah.
And Tony was running from them. And you know how...
and you know who started that story? It was you.
Not
Hairl.
And George, was it George that kissed you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just finished doing a piece of live copy, and I said, and of course George was standing right there, and I said, now once again, George Morgan. I thought he was just going to lean into the podium mic and introduce the next act. He never kissed me. Of course, Hairl had already told me the story about these two, and I'm thinking, oh, I don't know about that.
Set him up.
I set him up, yeah.
Talking about practical jokers, it's a well-known fact amongst this circle, and this will probably get edited out, but there was a tradition around the Opry for years, still is, and I was always told that George started it. And that was that thing about goosing people.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And George, I mean, he was fearless. He didn't care. And I remember the night that President Nixon showed up to the Opry. And of course, the ACUF was taking care of Nixon, and they're all squiring around, and there was this big finale thing on, you know what I'm talking about, this big finale thing on stage where I think Roy was singing I Saw the Light, and Nixon had his yo-yo, and they're all out doing this stuff. And George is standing behind Nixon about 2 or 3 feet over. And I'm standing on the other end, and I can see George. And all of a sudden, in the middle of this song, I see George put his hand down, his thumb comes out, and he starts to go for Nixon. and thank God, Jimmy Capps, the guitar player, saw it too, and just kind of reached down and got his arm and looked at George and said, you don't want to do that.
Secret, could you see a guy getting in trouble with the Secret Service for goosing the
He
president?
would too. That's the thing about George. He wouldn't.
In the 70s, there was at the Jimmy Rogers Festival in Meridian, Mississippi, Hank's bus broke down and he came in a car, and Ernest Tubb was already there. They were big supporters of the festival. And Hank had arranged for, or somebody had arranged for Hank to do an interview with a guy from a station around there, a radio station. And he asked Ernest if he could use his bus, and Ernest said, of course. So in a few minutes, bandy rooster that he was, came strutting off that bus, and he said, Ernest, don't ever let that young man on your bus again. and Ernest said, well, why is that? He said, well, he sat between myself, and this is a direct quote, sat between myself and his girlfriend, and he put his right hand on my knee and his left hand on her knee, and I think he's AM and FM. And he may well have been, I don't know.
Well, Hank used to, and I've been kidding quite a bit about this, when I was Opry House manager, he would call because he always had some complaint about something in the opera. Yeah. And he's very, professional in everything. And sometimes he'd even write about his complaint. Either the air conditioning in his dressing room was too hot or too cold or whatever. But what he really was upset about was his, what he called a buoy, because he was a seafaring youngster. It's a cone, an orange cone that you see on highways. But he called it his buoy. And he would call and say, Jerry, my buoy is dirty. And it's getting on my white suit, So eventually I just had Bobby Rose, you remember Bobby, the security guy, go ahead and move the buoy for Hank when he came in so he wouldn't have to touch it. But I'd get calls all the time from Hank about silly things, They're silly to me, not to him, of course,
Hank had a pink nudie suit that he wore. I don't remember whether you remember that or not, but he had a pink nudie suit. Yeah. And he strolled up to the podium one night, and I leaned over and I said, Hank, your fly is open. And he turned and he looked at me and he said, well, can you see my weapon? And I said, well, no, I can't, but the gun case is open, and he said, well, it's fully loaded. And then he walked off stage, and I guess he zipped up his pants because he came back,
It'd be months before you would learn your name.
I had that problem.
You were listening one night when when he called my name, and Bill and I joke about this all the time. He turned to me and says, and I want to, friends and neighbors, I want to thank our good friend and announcer, Hairl Hensley.
He's done that to me. I didn't get to work with Hank for a while. When I first started working the Opry, my shift seemed to always take me someplace other than Hank's segment. But we changed our schedule after a few years, and I got thrown in with Hank. And it took him probably 10 weeks to get my name down. And when he finally started to get it, he always had this little closing mantra he would say. He would say, what was it? This is Hank Snow, good night, good luck, good health, and may the good Lord always be proud of you. But he would always say, I want to thank everyone who's done a wonderful job on our show, and our good friend and announcer, Mr. Hairl Hensley. Well, finally, when he started to get my name, he would say, and our good friend and announcer, Kyle. But he finally got it.
Bill, you were talking about commercials. Chuck here had to do a dog food commercial.
What was the name of that dog food anyway?
Glad Wags dog food.
Glad Wags dog food, and I did the first one, and I just found out today that Harold did the last one.
Yeah, I did the last one.
And Mr. Acuff was the artist because it was during his portion. And after the first night it happened, I went home and told my wife. I said, Mr. Acuff's going to be mad at me because, and I think Billy Linneman was the original guy that started barking. And but I would be reading this Glad Wags dog food commercial, and Billy would come. He first started just working on my hair, and then you started hearing, woof, woof. Well, by my last year there's like 20 people around me going, woof, 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 woof. Connie Smith, and then they got out the lipstick, and they were painting circles around my eyes and playing with my legs, goosing, and barking going on like crazy.
While you're trying to do a live commercial.
Yeah, I'm doing a live commercial.
At least you had a little experience. They did that to me on my first night at the Opry. Let me tell you, Connie Smith can do a Chihuahua.
Oh, she does.
She's got a great Chihuahua.
That's right.
She does this little yapping that'll just drive you crazy.
Here's my first night at the Opry. They got my breeches legs rolled up. They got my coat tail tucked in my pants, and they're barking like dogs. And I'm trying to read, and I'm scared to death.
And I used to fear that Roy Acuff was going to chew me out for that. And I wasn't doing anything. I was just trying to read the spot. And I'd throw it back to him. Once again, here's Roy Acuff. And that's Chuck over there in the dog pound. and finally, one night, Bill, there's 20 or 30 people just working on me while I'm reading. And I think people even that were visitors were getting out of their seats to come over and join in. But after that one, I think Hal Durham had his cigar, and he came up to me and said, Chucky, if that gets to be a problem, I want to know about it. But it was a lot of fun.
What was that commercial that Harold used to have to do?
Zim's crack cream.
Zim's crack cream. Yes. Yes. Well, Hairl had the distinction of being the first announcer that got to read the Zim's crack cream commercial.
A total of 45 minutes to go gather people to stand behind him and giggle.
Right. Word had gotten out that this new sponsor was coming to the Opry that manufactured an ointment that you put on paper cuts and dry skin and so forth called Zim's crack cream. It's a big product now.
And a great product.
And it's very effective. But anyway, word got out, and everybody, of course, all the reprobates backstage just made all kinds of hay over this. And so the night before before the first reading of this commercial, it was you. That's right. That you went around and you gathered up people to come out and give Hairl a hard time.
Too good. I couldn't let the moment pass.
Harold, did you know you were going to have to read about crack cream?
Oh yeah. The Becky Jackson, who was and still is in traffic there at WSM, she told me about the sponsor, and so I looked at the copy and I said, no way.
But the sponsors were in the audience.
Oh, they were?
Yeah, some of
the sponsors
in the audience. Yeah.
Is that why they were only a sponsor one
I don't
week?
know. Harold did the last dog food commercial because there were like 40 people standing around and barking, and Connie was right in his face.
She was always the chihuahua. Oh, great chihuahua.
But it's a good thing that I lost my hearing a long time ago.
He got through it and never cracked. It was amazing.